Good evening, this is Open Book. I'm Richard Winham. My guest this evening is Mark L. Brooks, whose first novel, Laying Autumn's Dust, subtitled A Southern Tragedy About Betrayal, Revenge and Murder, has just been published. Mark is a graduate from UTC's creative writing program. After graduation with a master's degree, he moved to Colorado. He grew up in northeast Alabama in a small town on Puddin Ridge. He now lives here in Chattanooga. His debut novel is a carefully constructed history of a family living on the edge of poverty in a small town with few opportunities to make even enough money to live on. The novel is constructed as essentially three novels, in which each member of the family, Donnie, Abigail, and their son Jesse, is the narrator, confirming and confounding the narratives of the other two. The beauty of your novel, which makes it that much more of a challenge to break it down, is that it plays with time, it plays with chronology. And so to say, well, if we start in the beginning, we're starting in the beginning, but that's not true.
That's right. Yep, that's correct. Chronology, it's not in order. And I didn't want to do the kind of real time and then flashback in real time. Several chapters are constructed that way, which is fine. But I feel like, at least for the first of the three books within the novel, we jump in time more than later in the novel, and that's just helping establish everything that's in place. And I think of it kind of as a redneck Pulp Fiction in that regard, because it is in a lot of different places in time. I didn't want to put timestamps on it to help it seem more timeless. But no cell phones are in the novel. But really, for the most part, it could have happened over the last handful of weeks, as far as when you look at real time, because even though no cell phones are in it, it's in rural Alabama, and not everyone now has cell phones, and there are only a few, I guess, indicators throughout the novel as to the exact time frame, and so roughly it would be when I grew up.
That's my impression too. If you pin me down to what time frame are we talking here, what era, there isn't anything. And given that, do you think that this story could have happened in any generation?
Absolutely. For the type of story that we're dealing with, it touches on relationships, family relationships, lovers, friends, and how they are created, what holds them together or what breaks them apart. It touches on social issues such as domestic abuse. We have a couple of very intense scenes there with domestic abuse. It touches on alcoholism, PTSD, mental illness, racism, and litter. The only one of those called out by name is litter. All the other ones, we just see how characters are impacted by those issues and how they deal with it or fail to deal with it.
So we're starting with Donnie.
Starting with Donnie. So this will be from an earlier chapter, Donnie 2, so I'll read part of it, then jump ahead to the rest of it. But it starts with he and Abigail when they're dating, and so he's going out and teaching her how to shoot a gun, and then it goes to a flashback with him and his stepfather named Ricky. Grasshoppers jumped and buzzed over the fresh hay as I stared across the field. No, I thought. I sure as hell don't like Ricky. I just showed Abigail how to shoot a gun. I had helped her hit one bottle, then stood off to the side and made her break the second one on her own. She had flinched when she had pulled the trigger. The bottle had set on a stump, and the slug plowed a furrow behind it. Might try holding the gun steady. She had flashed a dirty look at me, but she smiled. On her second shot, the bullet took a chunk from the edge of the stump. Might try keeping your eyes open. She had swung that pistol toward me. Might try keeping your mouth shut. I hadn't hit the ground that fast and that hard since I'd played football. She had doubled over, the gun dangling at her side. God damn it, I said, standing. Don't never point a gun at nobody unless you aim to use it. She had kept laughing. It ain't funny, Abigail, I'd said. But she had got me tickled, and I'd started laughing too. I'd dusted off my breeches. She had straightened up, aimed, and fired. When the bottle shattered, she had blowed the tip of the barrel like she is some hot shot. She had looked at me sideways and smiled, and I'd walked up and kissed her. I had took the gun and tucked it in my waistband. She had hugged me, and we had kissed again and held hands as we headed to the truck. Then she had ruined it by asking about Ricky. Abigail was always nosing around my business with my stepfather and asking why I never mentioned him or why I called him Ricky. It weren't no secret, but the more she pried, the more it bothered me, so I never said nothing. This time it was my fault for saying his name, but I couldn't think of no other excuse fast enough to explain them beer bottles in the bed of my truck. And Abigail didn't know Ricky left most of his empties near road signs. I'd let go of her hand and turned toward the field. Ricky was a good-sized drinker, but I had plenty of other reasons for not liking him. He was bossy, he never took me hunting or fishing, and he only wanted me around when he needed something. But the main reason I hated him was because he had made me do his dirty work at Mr. Buffington's liquor store, then betrayed me. The first time I'd stoked for him, I was 10. Ricky had made it clear I didn't have no say in the matter, so when he parked the truck, I'd followed him through the heavy glass door. Bottles, different shapes and sizes, had lined the shelves. Ricky had picked one up, set it on the shelf, and eased along another aisle. Whenever he touched something, I gazed if I could hide it under my shirt. He had told me to keep my eyes down, but I couldn't help but glance at the man standing behind the counter. Once he was watching me, but usually he was reading the newspaper. He wore his eyeglasses on the tip of his nose, and a cigarette moved with his lips as he read. As we neared the back, Ricky turned a bottle of whiskey in his hand. I recognized the brand from our kitchen cabinet. This time he placed it on the bottom shelf. "Tie your shoes, son." Ricky lit a cigarette as he headed toward the cooler. I dropped to one knee and pretended to tie my shoelace. My hands trembled. "Can't smoke in here," the man said. When I heard his voice, I slid the bottle from the shelf and stuffed it halfway in my pants, my belt holding it snug against me. "Do what?" Ricky said. I pulled my shirt tail down and stood. My nerves were shot. "No smoking in the store," the man said. "You gotta be shitting me." "My store. Don't like it. There's the door." He stared at Ricky over his glasses and through his own cigarette smoke. Ricky stepped out, and for a blink, I feared he had stranded me. But before the door closed, he come back and walked to the cooler. He snagged a six-pack. When he paid, I stood so close I smelt smoke on his shirt. I didn't look at the man. Ricky shoved the coins in his pocket and we left. He got a cigarette off the icebox while I climbed in the truck. "Give it," he said as we pulled from the parking lot. He seen me shaking when I handed in the bottle. So then we go on here through part of this chapter. He starts working for Mr. Buffington some, but for that week he worked for him. And then after he worked that week for him, Mr. Buffington's taking him home. Several men had visited Mr. Buffington throughout the week, and they had spun yarns and laughed and called him Buckshot. But I didn't piece it together until hearing about the robber. I wondered if Ricky had knowed that story when he had hatched his own plan. On Saturday, when Mr. Buffington brung me home, I looked out the window during the ride. He remained quiet until we pulled in the drive. "You worked hard this week, and nobody works for me for free." He slid me a $5 bill. I stretched it full length between my thumbs. The fact that I'd never held $5 of my own weren't lost on him. "Put that in your pocket." "Yes, sir." I folded it and done as he said. "I could use your help next week, too. I'll check with your mother." I smiled and reached for the door. "Donnie," Mr. Buffington said, and something about his voice caught my attention. I held still, fingers wrapped around the handle. "You ain't got to steal for him." I paused a moment longer, then opened the door and jumped out. Ricky was standing in the yard, and Mr. Buffington stuck his head out the driver's side window. "You ever set foot in my store again, you son of a bitch, I'll shoot your sorry ass." He drove away, and I smiled again. So that, as we touched on earlier, that Mr. Buffington would have been Donnie's positive role model. And then we learned that he was killed when Donnie was about 18. And that's actually not even a part of the murder mystery. The novel is part murder mystery, part coming-of-age story, and that's just something else that happened in these people's lives that impact them.
Yeah, it's one of those events that has a profound impact on people's lives, and yet nobody ever seems to really get to the heart of it. What happened?
Right. Yeah. There's a conversation later, but between Marlon and Donnie, and they touch on that barely, but we know that it's remained with Donnie that he knows, he realizes things would be different in his life had Mr. Buffington lived, and he just really doesn't take accountability for his actions.
Yes, and that's how I feel too. Okay, fair enough. His life was probably derailed by the loss of Mr. Buffington.
Right.
it's easy to see that. There seems to be almost an inevitability about the way his life spirals. Obviously, because he's the protagonist in his own life to a large extent, he becomes more mean-spirited and aggressive as he gets a little older. And I'm assuming that's just a response to loss of dreams and frustration.
Sure, that absolutely comes into play, and he always conveniently has something to blame for things that happen. And like we said, he doesn't take accountability, but from his perspective, he ultimately feels like he should be in control of everything as a husband and as a father, and he feels like decisions should be his, and things that happen should be because that's how he wants it to happen, or the way he would direct things to happen. And to your point, the bigger picture of things that go wrong with the family, maybe he realizes he can't control those things, and so he's very dominant and controlling with the things that he feels like he has more of a handle of controlling.
So the whole story might have been different if Donnie had more self-awareness and maybe a bit more drive.
Absolutely. And there's one point later in the novel where it feels like that he's coming close, as close as we see him coming to maybe acknowledging that he hadn't been the best person. And then there is a misinterpretation of something that is said, and that thought really goes from his mind very quickly. And that kind of touches on how in the novel we have 3 first-person points of view, and no character intentionally misleads the reader, but we are limited to the first person's perception and how they interpret information. And so one example that is minor is that we see one scene, we have some crossover scenes. So we see one scene where Donnie comes in from the porch when Jesse's eating breakfast. And from Donnie's perspective, he tells him to go out and load firewood in the truck. And Jesse gets up immediately and goes outside. From Donnie's perspective, he says that's the way it ought to be, meaning I said it and he minded me. From Jesse's perspective, we see that crossover scene. And from his perspective, he just didn't want to be in the same room with his father. So as soon as his father came in, he was already planning on getting up to leave. And it just coincided with what Donnie told him to do. So 2 very different things going on there with what is actually going on in the different characters' minds. And some bigger pieces come into play with that in the novel. That's a very minor example, but it gives you an idea of how to read the novel and piece things together.
Well, the novel overall is a remarkably detailed web of relationships in a relatively close-knit community. But I'm tempted to think that you wrote it as a straight narrative and then came back and said, well, I'm going to cut it up and repiece it together. Is that how you composed it?
Well, the part of it probably comes across that way because I actually did not write it in order. And so I had written, it all started from a short story from Jesse's perspective. And I knew I always wanted to expand that. And then finally, after moving back here from Colorado, I made time to work on it. And so the short story was about 10,000 words long, and I thought it was going to be Jesse's first 2 chapters. So I ended up writing Donnie's first chapter, Abigail's first chapter, and then Donnie's second chapter, the real time, not the flashback. I didn't know why he and Ricky didn't like each other at the time. And then at that point, I wrote several Jesse chapters, or early versions of the chapters. And I worked on some of Donnie's chapters. And all that to say, the last 5 chapters I wrote were Abigail's last 5 chapters. So really, her narrative kind of works as her instinct as a mother to try to hold family together. Her narrative really holds the novel together. And as you're talking about, it feels like I kind of went back and made all these different things happen. Some things that happened I didn't plan on, so since it wasn't plotted out, I was writing one scene, for example, at the end of the first book in Donnie's 3rd chapter. I call it the creek scene. And I started writing that scene because I knew I wanted that scene. And that's how I would approach some scenes in the novel was I would write a scene and I would look at how did we logically get here? And then where does it logically or realistically go from here? And I wanted that creek scene, but I originally started writing it with two different characters in mind from what we see in the novel. And it's as though the camera panned from the two characters I thought I was writing about, and then I saw the two characters that are in the novel, which when you read it, you'll see what that scene's all about. But it was at that moment when I thought, okay, I've got about 8 different chapters that are kind of all over the place, but that scene gave me the confidence I needed to say, okay, this is what I needed to have a novel. I can now work with this, and all this is going to come together for me because of that scene, which I had not intended. Those two characters were going to be a part of it. It's as though, like I said, the camera changed and showed me the real two characters I was writing about, and that was just a very fun moment for me because I realized, okay, I now can work on a novel. Until then, I didn't have one.
The section that you just read, that's essentially the seeds of Donnie and Abigail's story, is so much more resonant after reading the entire novel. It's almost as if there's a deal of benefit to reading the novel twice. The first time to just enjoy the writing and to just meet life as we meet life every day. Mm-hmm. That's how the novel reads. Like, this is how life happens. A lot of the time it's not predictable. A lot of the time it doesn't go the way you expected it to.
That's right.
So to then read it the second time and be aware of all these harbingers in that, as an example, that section you just read. And I was wondering if you could read a section from Abigail's point of view at around the same time.
Yeah, absolutely.
When she and Donnie were just teenagers and besotted with each other. They had a really it's a love affair.
And I appreciate you mentioning reading it twice. First of all, I'm very thankful and grateful for anyone who reads it one time, so thank you. but I do feel like that it was written in such a way to where hopefully people enjoy the novel as they see it. And it doesn't mean they have to catch every detail within the novel. But certainly if you reread it, then I think there's another level of appreciation because Jesse's first chapter, for example, it introduces a lot of information, but after you've read the novel, you really see, you can go back and read it and have a better appreciation for some of the things that come up in Jesse's first chapter, which is why it's the right first chapter.
And it's a much deeper appreciation of your craft that you spend a lot of time.
I did.
Working all this out. It's beautifully crafted and written. And as we when we talked about it last time, your use of language, it's already cinematic in its detail. You can see these people, but you can, especially when you're reading it, so you have the accent. The way that you have written it, that's a challenge in itself, isn't it? A lot of people have tried to do that, to capture the patois, if you will, the southern accent, with sort of varying degrees of success.
Yeah, and one thing that I worked hard on was I needed 3 distinct voices. And so I've had some people tell me when they first start reading Jesse's first paragraph, they say, well, you have a few errors here because Jesse and Donnie both have subject-verb agreement issues, that they have grammatical issues. Donnie has more than Jesse, and he has a heavier dialect than Jesse. But I say, no, that's intentional. So to have those 3 different voices, Abigail in her narrative and in her dialogue, she doesn't make any grammatical errors. And then Donnie is going to make more than any other character. That's a main character, and then Jesse's somewhere in between. And the example I use is Abigail will say knew or had known. Donnie says knowed and had knowed, and Jesse says knew and had knowed. And so that is my way of showing how Jesse is a mixture of his parents in a lot of different ways, but him using knew properly, but then had knowed improperly, just shows the some of the level of attention to detail I had to put to make sure I can have these three distinct voices.
It's also an interesting commentary on the role of women in this society and in this small town. What you're implying is that Abigail is the guardian. She's the one who keeps everybody straight, on the straight and narrow. Donnie is oblivious to it. Donnie is just Donnie.
That's right.
Abigail, on the other hand, as expressed through the way she speaks, is aware all the time of the way things should be. The polite way to comport yourself, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Was that deliberate on your part?
Yeah, sure. That's a very big part of her character, absolutely. Mm. And I would work on some of these different attributes to characters without spoon feeding or having any type of explanation. And that's the way I approach the novel. I'm a Hemingway fan. I like his iceberg theory on writing, and so he and Faulkner, I think, do a great job of not telling all the details. They just present the story, and that's why I like their writing, is because you have to sort of be actively involved with that writing. So yeah, you're right. And some of that stuff in the social issues we talked about, it's not just laid out. There's no one who's ever going to point and say this is what's going on. You just have to kind of learn that throughout the story in your reading of it.
So this is Abigail.
This is Abigail, and this is some of the scenes I said crossover. So this is her with Donnie from the same little snippet that I read earlier where they're shooting the gun. So this is from her side of it, at least that scene. Then I'll go on a little bit further. We kept a pistol in the nightstand on Donnie's side of the bed. I made sure it was loaded and hurried to the porch. Tears burned my eyes, but I could see my husband clear enough to point the gun at him. I held the pistol steady with both hands and remembered how heavy it had felt the first time I fired it. Donnie had wanted me to know how to handle a gun, so he had taken me shooting. We were just dating then, but we hoped to marry. Donnie had parked beside a field and reached in the back of the truck for a couple of empty beer bottles and set them on the opposite edges of a large stump. He showed me how to aim, warned about recoil, and helped me hit the first one. I was surprised at how loud the shot had sounded, but I smiled at Donnie over my shoulder after the bottle shattered. Donnie stepped aside and hooked his thumbs in his pockets on his old blue jeans. When I fired the pistol on my own, a dirt clod flew up in the field. Then I chipped the stump. But on the third shot, I broke the other bottle. Walking to the truck, I asked Donnie where the bottles came from. He sniffed. I reckon they's Ricky's. I looked sideways at him. Do you always call him Ricky? Donnie stopped. He spat tobacco juice in the dirt. What else am I supposed to call him? He ain't my father. I sure as hell don't like him, and he sure as hell don't like me. We stood quiet for a minute, Donnie staring across the field. I wondered what was going through his mind, but he always put up a wall when I asked about his stepfather. What about the glass? I said. Donnie was pressing his thumb in his palm. He seemed far away. Do what? Should we clean up the broken glass? Ain't our problem. He headed to the truck. I gathered the pieces anyway. When I placed them in the bed of the truck, I saw more bottles. And even though we went shooting a lot, we never ran out of targets. The one time I knew where they came from was when the county fair was in town, and Donnie took me to the fairgrounds. We rode most of the rides and played games. Donnie liked the dunking tank, and he showed off his muscles by ringing the bell both times he swung the sledgehammer. When I saw the shooting gallery, I pulled Donnie toward it by a sleeve. I had all the bullseyes, and the man at the booth told me to pick a prize. Then he said he would like to take me shooting. Donnie looked at the man. Like hell you will. I didn't mean nothing by it, he said. Donnie stretched across the counter and grabbed the man's collar with one hand and punched his face with the other. The man staggered, and I heard someone holler, You can't let that slide. Kick his ass, Donnie. Greg and Amy had walked up. As I pulled Donnie from the booth, I glanced back and saw the man holding his bloody nose. You didn't have to hit him, I said, but I felt pride in the way my man had stood up for me. Donnie needed to simmer down, so the four of us went to his truck. He had hidden a cooler beneath blankets in the back, and he opened 2 beers and passed one to Greg. Amy smiled and took it from him, so Donnie gave Greg another one and slid the bottle opener in his pocket. When Donnie offered me his beer, I shook my head. I'd never tried alcohol. Oh, come on, Abigail, Donnie said. 1 drink. Greg and Amy watched. When I sipped it, they cheered. I held the beer toward Donnie. You didn't even taste it, he said. Take you a good pull. He winked at Amy, and she smiled again. I took another sip. I knew what the preacher and my parents said about drinking, so the bottle felt heavy. Donnie waved off the beer, opened one for himself, and chugged it. He set his empty bottle in the bed of the truck and popped open another cap, and I thought about all the targets I'd shattered. You said those bottles were Ricky's. They was, he grinned, but the beer was mine. They all laughed, but I wondered what other lies Donnie had told.
That's my guest, Mark Brooks, reading from his debut novel, Laying Autumn's Dust. This is Open Book, and we are nearing the close of our spring membership drive for 2025. Of all the programs I produce for the station, this is the one for which I am, in some ways, the most grateful. I can't imagine hosting and producing a show quite like this on any other station, and it's only because of your support that I'm able to do it here. So I just wanted to take a few minutes together with our station manager, Susan Lazenby, to talk to you about the ever-increasing importance of your support for all the programs we carry here on WUTC.
I have to say that over the past year while we've been working together, one of the things that I have appreciated tremendously, that I think has helped us grow in our friendship, is our conversations about books that we've had, because you have been reading books for Open Book, and you bring those to me, and you talk to me about what's impactful and the authors that you're talking with, and I feel deeply connected to what you're reading, and I want to read it too. And I feel like that's what you're doing for our listeners that have us both on air or on their Alexa or on their computer, and they can hear about what you're reading and they can want to read it too. Books are such a bridge. It's a way to be somewhere else and learn new things and to hear stories. They're exquisite. I am an avid reader, and I'm completely thrilled by this show, and I really hope that you, our listener, is also thrilled by this, and that you'll consider making a donation to WUTC by going to our website and donating some funds so that we can continue these great book discussions that we're having, and having authors come in and talk with Richard, and that we can have all this wonderful content.
Absolutely. WUTC.org, of course, is our website address. If you're listening to us online, you already know that. Just go back to the home page, and there's a pledge button on there. I just had a conversation last hour with a writer called Mark Brooks. To Susan's point, this book is about a family living in northeast Alabama in a fairly small town. And it's ingeniously created. It makes, as we already know, that family is a web, and living in a relatively small community is a web too. So everybody is sort of interrelated. The relationships sort of cross like the strands of a web. And when you start to write a story, you have to somehow pull those strands apart and make clear the relationship between the various people in the novel. And in this instance, he's done that by telling the story from the point of view of three different people: the mother, the father, and their son Jesse. Then he time shifts, and I told him about halfway through the novel, it began to feel like I was in this sort of whirlpool where everybody is being swept together, and there's only so much they can do to control that. So to your point about the insights that you get from reading, if you have never had the experience of talking to people who live in a small town in Alabama, it's a revelation. Why people think the way they do, why they behave the way they do. He goes into some detail with that, while at the same time creating a very compelling narrative that's fun to read.
You know, Richard, I got to hear part of that interview that you were having with Mark, and I have to say that one of the most impactful things for me was hearing him talk about rewriting one particular sentence 4 times. And as a reader, and again, I am a voracious reader. I go through several books, sometimes a week, and sometimes, every month also. And hearing the author talk about the fine-tuning and crafting of that is not something that I would get from just picking this book up. But hearing you talk to him and hearing him explain his process adds a whole nother depth and dimension to the book, so that when I can pick it up and read it, because you had it first, then I'll have to read it after, I can pick it up and read it and find that sentence and know that he took such care so that he could convey this picture to me, the reader, about what's happening. And I would not have gotten that without your show and without your interviewing. And I tremendously appreciate the time that you put into reading the books beforehand, researching the authors, and then bringing them in to talk to them. It is a labor, but it really is, no pun intended, it's a labor of love for the listener, for you, the people that are listening to this show. It is such a gift.
Thank you. First, to talk to the people who make the music or who write the books, or who, in the case of my friend Peggy specifically, because he's the playwright with whom I've had the most conversations, it's just astonishing how much time and energy goes into creating something. And I'm curious how you decide which books you are going to read.
I have a daughter, and when she came to college, I didn't want to mom her every time I talked to her. So I said, hey, Catherine, you're reading, I'll read everything you're reading. I read every book that she tells me that I should read, so that we can talk about it and have these same sorts of discussions about the characters, the plot, what's going on in the books. On top of that, I also read because I'm in a book club, and we just recently read James, and we're going to meet and talk about that book in just a couple of weeks, and it was profound. I don't know if you've read that one or not, but it was exquisite. It's written from the point of view of Jim, the slave that was on the island that Huck Finn went out and spent time with. And it is one of the most beautifully written books that I've read in as long as I can remember. I mean, I was voracious. I was reading it. I could not get enough or put it down. So I read in both of those ways. And then sometimes I see or hear things like, on your show, or I'll pick up things from other friends, and I'll pick those up and read them too, because it's important for me to always keep my mind active and be learning new things and seeing new things without watching TV. Because when I read, I see pictures in my head of all the characters.
Me too.
Yeah, I love that.
I do too. My mother always insisted that we should go to the library and get a book every week. You can watch some television, but I want to see you reading too. And, because there was some resistance on our part. It is like entering another world every time. And to enter the world in which Jim lived with Huck Finn in the era in which he lived, I mean, that I think there's no substitute for a book to be able to do that. You can make a film, but it's not going to have the same. You bring your imagination to the book, and you see these people, and you see them as you see them. Frequently people complain about films made of books and say, no, that's not the way that person looks. We have such an investment, and that's what led me to want to do this show. And again, as I said earlier, the opportunity to do this is invaluable as far as I'm concerned, because it's just not something that ever happens on commercial radio. And so we are, as with all of so many other programs on the station, every program on the station, the same argument could be made that these programs exist only because public radio exists, and public radio, of course, only exists because you support it. It's as simple as that. And it's a wonderful relationship that we have with you. And we all benefit from it, I think. Me talking to the writers and you listening to what they have to say is, I think, an invaluable opportunity to hear about books that otherwise probably, because I think about that, there's a staggering number of books published every month.
That is very true.
And only a very few reach a very wide audience, I think.
The 1 in a million shot, right? And there's some really exquisite novels that you've talked about on this show that people wouldn't have had the chance to read or listen to if you like audiobooks, which I do because I love it when people read me stories. But it's something you won't get anywhere else. One other thing that I really love about books, they don't just paint a picture in your in your mind, but you get to hear the inner dialogue and the thinking of the characters. You're not just watching someone's face, but you get to hear what they're thinking by reading the words on the page. You get to see their emotional growth from that very thorough perspective that the author gives you. And you don't get that from watching TV or watching a movie. You really grow with the characters, and you have those moments of like exquisite reckoning and joy and despair that you can't get from just watching a movie. So even if you read a book and then watch the movie of the book, you're going to get a lot more by reading that book than you would have just the movie. And I think it's a really found experience. So I really do appreciate our listeners that have donated money to WUTC and are going to continue to donate. And I would encourage them to call and support the show. And I would love to hear from people about your favorite book that you've heard about while you were listening to this. I would love it if you sent me an email and said, this is my favorite book that Richard's ever done on the show. That would be really... That'd be a great way for me to build a to-read list, because I haven't heard all of your shows, and I'm sure somebody's thinking.
Well, I'd be really curious to hear that too.
Yeah.
And I think your daughter is so lucky to have you in her life that you were willing to do that, and I would imagine allowed you to bond in ways that you would never have done otherwise.
That's true. I've read a lot of things I would have never picked up, and they've been really fun. And also,
well, it brings up topics that you probably wouldn't have thought to talk about with her, right? And so she gets your point of view and you get hers.
Yeah, we see very different things when we read the books, which is really interesting, because I'll comment about some things and then she'll comment about other things. So it's really great. The same thing when my friends and I have book club too. We'll all hear or see different things in the books, and we take turns picking, which is, I guess you have different books that you pick every month for this, but I love seeing the things that other people pick and how different it is. I probably would have never picked James up if it wasn't for my book club. I would have picked something else. I really love post-apocalyptic books when I'm thinking for myself, but I wouldn't have thought about it. And now I would say it's probably one of my favorite things that I've read this year, just because I heard about it from somebody else. And I think that our listeners hear about these books from you and have that same moment. They're like, I'm going to go get this book and I'm going to read it because Richard talked about it. I heard from the author. I heard that he wrote that same sentence 4 times, just to get it perfect. And he cared about it. And I'm going to read it. And they have that moment too. It's lovely.
WUTC.org. I hope you will consider, if you haven't done already, making a pledge. Many people have already done it. We've come this far because so many people have elected to be sustaining members, which is a remarkable contribution that people have been making for some years now, where they just said, look, I'll give you X amount of dollars every month. And then they just gave us a credit card number or a checking account number, and that amount of money is debited every month. So, it's like, as with any business, to have a stable source of income is invaluable. And there are so many people, you may well be one, and thank you so much if you are. If you haven't as yet considered doing that, you may want to consider doing that. If you want to make a one-time pledge, thank you so much for your help, your support, and your consideration. WUTC.org is our website address. Thanks. Back now to my conversation with Mark Brooks. I'm just trying to imagine how you work all this out. It's almost like working a puzzle.
That's exactly how I thought of it. It very much was like working a puzzle, and sometimes the pieces fell into place very nicely and surprisingly so with things that happened. There were a couple of characters that I felt like I needed to have in the novel, and then kind of as it turned out, I realized, I've almost inadvertently already introduced them earlier, so we kind of already know these characters. And that surprised me. I was really kind of dreading how am I going to introduce these characters, because sometimes it's tough to introduce new characters. Sometimes it's easy depending on the level or the role the character plays, but sometimes it's very difficult to put yourself in a realistic position for how these people met and how they became connected and then how they developed this relationship. And other times it was much more difficult to connect the dots, and I had to work to piece things together. And I also wanted it to be very realistic. I didn't want anything to feel forced or hokey, so if something didn't feel right, then I would have to go back through it and rethink how does this happen in a way to where it feels right and does work out realistically. But it was fun.
Well, the novel is is very organic, in part, as it just said, because of the way you use the language. But I think more than that, it's almost, well, it is second nature to you to describe this community because it's very similar to the community in which you grew up.
Absolutely. Yeah, I grew up in Northeast Alabama.
I want to give you credit for your eye for detail and your understanding of the socioeconomic divide that traps the characters.
Right.
Both those who appear to be more prosperous as those who are less prosperous, I think.
Right.
You know, they're all caught up in this tableau in which they play a part.
That's right. Yeah, they are, and the setting is where I grew up in Deerhead Cove, and lots of dust imagery because I grew up on the dirt road, right where the blacktop meets dirt, and so that's just part of life. And we would have to ride the bus through the dusty roads, and you're breathing all that in, and until we got to the blacktop. Yeah, all that comes into play: the socioeconomic, the different relationships. Some neighbors you know more than others, some you just wave to, and that's as far as it goes. So yes, definitely all that comes into play.
The characters, if you were to see them as archetypes, are familiar from Tennessee Williams, from William Faulkner, Flannery O'Connor. So there are, I guess, literary archetypes from the South. But your understanding of the culture and the people goes way beyond archetypes and makes them human.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. I worked hard to make it authentic with the characters and what each character brings to the table. And certainly you're drawing on life. Even in fiction, you draw from different instances in your life.
If it's going to say anything, right?
Right, yeah. Yeah, you absolutely have to. And it was fun for me. And like I said, some of the scenes surprised me, but some of the scenes I very much wanted to include in the novel. Other times I'm working on a scene and someone comes from thin air I hadn't planned on. So, for example, early in the novel, Abigail's talking to her parents. It's a very serious conversation. And as I'm writing this, suddenly her sister barges in the room with her school books and says, "What's going on?" And she knows, she's actually kind of excited. She says, "Is Abigail or did you catch Abigail drinking beer again?" or something along those lines. And I thought, I didn't know Abigail had a sister. It's important information for me to know. But it was fun because you're just so into the scene when you're writing. And for me, I felt like I really watched about 80% of the novel play out. The characters just doing things and things like that happening that you don't actively think about. It's just you're in that moment of creativity, and it's a lot of fun.
So the question as to whose story you are telling is very complicated.
It is.
Again, on one level, it could be said to be Donnie's because he's the patriarch, and at least from his point of view, he is the mover and shaker. Things happen because he wants them to, and they don't because he doesn't. That's, of course, not true, but that's how he sees it.
That's right.
But I guess it could equally be argued that this is Abigail's story and absolutely Jesse's story. The interesting thing about telling Jesse's story is that you are able to tell it, well, each time I think I've got a handle on it, I realize that's not true. The first time we meet Donnie, he's not even a teenager. He's still a child, which is also true of Jesse.
Right.
Really, the only difference, I guess, is that the arc of Jesse's story is an entire lifetime.
That's right. Ultimately, the bulk of the novel takes place within about a year and a half. So it starts with Jesse's summer going into his junior year in high school, and then it ends with the summer after he's a senior. I'm sorry, the summer before he's a senior, and then the summer after he graduates high school is the bulk of what the novel, as far as I guess you would say real time goes. And
but at the same time, we have a narrative from Jesse that represents his entire life. He's an old man.
That's right. So yeah, we see flashbacks with him being younger, and then the novel is bookended by Jesse's chapters. And so things that happen to Jesse, we see Abigail and Donnie when they're younger and dating, but really the coming of age story is about Jesse. We see some specific events in his life that impact his decisions later in life. And the final Jesse chapter, it does close with him being an older man, kind of looking back on some things that has happened in his life, as well as we see some real-time things going on within his life that help us better understand some things we read earlier and how they impact him throughout his life, especially as he's sitting there in that final chapter.
So, in practical terms, as a writer, you can't have Jesse be the narrator because it's impossible for him to know some of these things. He wasn't even alive
That's right.
when some of those things happened. And yet, it could be seen that the entire novel is Jesse recounting his memories.
That's exactly right, and it's funny you say that because I'm a big fan of A River Runs Through It, and I read the book and really loved the book and read it several times because the movie was so well done. And in the movie, that's how it's presented. He's the older Norman McLean is fishing in the river, and then the movie is essentially his reminiscing on his life, and then it closes with him in the river. And you're right, unless all that information was told to Jesse, he wouldn't be able to do that. But it is structured similar in that way to where you're not too far off from your point there. It just can't quite happen that way. But
no, can you imagine? I mean, God, what a burden! The poor kid has enough of a burden as it is.
That's right.
As you said, he's as we all are, a composite. Obviously, of a lot of influences, but those primary influences are our family, the people we grew up with. So Jesse is equally influenced by Donnie and Abigail. He has a much more sympathetic attitude to Abigail, which, as the novel progresses, becomes apparent for obvious reasons.
Right.
And yet, it could equally be argued that in some ways Jesse has always got this Mr. Hyde inside him from Donnie.
Yeah, that is a very good argument, and there are a couple of things that happen within the novel to where he has to make sure he controls that, and he's put in some situations to where early on he gets in a fight with someone at school, so we see he has that volatile side as well. And there are things that come up later in his life throughout the story that we read to where, even if it's not stated specifically, he's got to make that decision as far as which way to go. And those decisions are not always easy.
No, they're not. Would you care to read something from Jesse's point of view?
Yeah, this will be after he graduates. He ends up in Coleman with Conley, who is the positive role model for him.
So that's a really interesting echo. Donnie with Mr. Buffington.
Yes, Stanley Buffington.
So Donnie and Mr. Buffington and Jesse and Conley, it's a similar kind of relationship.
It very much is. And later, at some point, Jesse acknowledges he wasn't sure where he would be without Conley's influence. And so we never see Donnie specifically say that about Mr. Buffington's loss, but they come very close to kind of laying that out. But yeah, that is very much the comparison there. Donnie lost his mentor and Jesse found one because the guy who lost his mentor wasn't a good mentor for him. And it's Conley, like I said, Conley and Abigail are first cousins, and that comes into play. But he goes there and works at Conley's sawmill for several years before he moves back home. And
so I was listening to All Things Considered yesterday, and they were talking to a psychologist, and she was talking about masculinity. And she said it's really important for boys to have a masculine role model. That if there's not a masculine role model in their life, then they are, like I guess I should say we, are not taught how to cope with our emotions. That a positive role model, male role model, it's not going to work if it's a female. It has to be a male who shows you this is how males deal with these feelings. So in that sense, Donnie is absolutely a victim. He lost the person who might very well have helped him become a more functioning adult.
That's right. And essentially Mr. Buffington kind of tried to pick up that mantle, and then he was taken away. The way Conley knows that Donnie's not a good role model, and tries to and does pick up the mantle there. So yeah, certainly you look at a lot of similarities between these two, and one that did not work out because of a death, and the other one does.
So that in part might explain why Jesse survives where Donnie, I don't think we're given a spoiler here really, Donnie doesn't.
Right. Yeah, and so, yeah, absolutely. Jesse is better able to cope and understand it and deal with these issues. And also, of course, you have not only the masculine influence, but Abigail, who really helps him in other ways, as well as tough. I mean, he saw his mother. She suffers more really than anyone else in the novel, what she has to go through and put up with. And Jesse says something along the lines of, she had endured more than any person I knew, and she, he doesn't say she still remained positive, but something along those lines. And she has as much grit as any of the tough guys in this novel, and Jesse recognizes that.
And I guess it could be argued that Donnie's demise is a result of him not having learned how to deal with his emotions.
Yeah, taking action, not being able to handle emotions, and in a way not caring. He certainly
was feeling powerless. It seems, as if he hasn't been given that the tools to cope with emotions he doesn't know how to handle.
Yeah, and of course we see different ways that he can make excuses for that. We see him in a couple places justifying his actions, certainly just in little snippets, but you'll see him basically trying to put blame on other people for some of the things that he does.
And I don't know, in some sense, that's kind of understandable, and maybe we should be sympathetic that he's a victim of not having been treated properly when he was a kid, when he was coming of age.
Yeah, you can make that argument, and I've had people who hate Donnie. I've had people who like Donnie. It's always fun to get people's different perspectives, but it comes down to ultimately at some point, even though he had this person taken away, he still just seems to refuse to take accountability for his actions and doesn't seem to care about the consequences. Or makes excuses for the consequences.
To criticize him is to assume that he could.
That's a fair point.
I'm not sure he can. My initial response, as I'm sure is probably the response of many readers, dislike him intensely. Mm-hmm. He's a very unpleasant person in many ways, but it's a really valuable insight, I think, to see Donnie the way you have drawn him, as a flawed but not a lost human being.
Correct.
He's got a good side too.
He does, and certainly I realized at some point that we needed to see that, because otherwise I don't think it's a lot of fun to have a character that it's just everyone's going to hate this character, or someone who does something good all the time. It's really hard to have that kind of character. So even Abigail, as good as she is, we see her do things, or at least entertain certain ideas, and what we see, she's a real firecracker, as Murray puts it in the novel, and she does a few things that you go, well, that seems out of character in a way, but not really. So what I read here from Jesse's perspective is he's in Coleman here. He's sitting in front of Conley. He had just 2 nights before this, he and Conley's daughter had spent some time together on the golf course behind Conley's house, and Conley doesn't know, to Jesse's knowledge, that he and his daughter were together. And then the night before this scene, Conley had been waiting outside, and so Jesse and Billy Sue they were not able to get together because Conley was outside, and Jesse realized that and had to go away. So this is them at work together. They're at the sawmill the next day. And then after this chapter ends, I will read just the first few lines of Abigail's next chapter just to show how some of the chapters go into each other. So we're in Coleman here, and earlier Jesse was kind of dreading his mom coming to visit because he had expected he and Billy Sue would be wanting to be together, and if his mom was there, they couldn't be together as much. So I'll pick it up here at work the next day after the failed attempt to get back with Billy Sue because Conley was outside. At the sawmill the next morning, Conley had bags beneath his eyes. I had dodged him after clocking in, but he had sent for me at lunch. Of all the times I'd sat in his office, I'd never found myself on the business end of his desk until now. Am I working you too hard, son? No, sir. I'd barely slept in 2 nights and must have looked as wore out as he did. Know why I called you in here? The chair creaked. No, sir. Since moving to Coleman, I'd become a card player, gambling small money with coworkers twice a week, but it was all I could do to keep a poker face while bluffing Conley. I held my breath. You cost me good timber. He run his hand over the back of his neck, tilting his head one way and then the other. I breathed again. I culled them ruined boards so you could dock my pay. Running the circulars all yesterday, I'd kept glancing at the clock, distracted by everything me and Billy Sue had done the night before, and geared up to lay with her again. By the time the whistle had blowed, I had a pile of scrap wood. Not the lumber I'm worried about. You know how Marty lost his fingers? I nodded. You cut off your hand, it would take Jesus Christ himself to convince your mama it wasn't my fault. Yes, sir. I'll be more mindful. He took a cigar from a box and bit off the end, then spat it in the trash can beside his desk. I also want to talk to you about Billy Sue. I squeezed the sides of the seat. He rolled the cigar between his fingers and thumb while a sweat bead inched down my chest. I recalled how, on the golf course, I had turned tail and run, but sitting at his desk I was forced to play the cards Conley dealt. We're family, he said, and leaned back. My stomach jumped. Conley and Mama was first cousins. Before coming to Coleman, I'd only met him once, when me and Billy Sue was kids, so I'd never considered them close kin. So I trust you, he finally said. Billy Sue seeing some boy on the sly. I sat still. I figured he was testing me, hoping I'd show my hand. Sweat kept trickling down my chest. Tried to sneak out again last night. I know she's 19, but under my roof, you live by my rules. Yes, sir. He had said again, so he must have caught Billy Sue slipping in the house the first night we was together. I saw you with her at the company picnic. I gripped that seat. He reached for a small box of matches and tapped it on his desk. Them matchsticks rattled. Did she mention a boy? As he slid the box open, I realized Conley was off the scent. I let go of the chair and took a deep breath. I squinted at the picture hanging behind him and scratched my chin. No, sir. She didn't say nothing about no boy. My mind drifted to Billy Sue's small curves and her milky skin in the moonlight, and I wondered when I'd see her again. Well, it's been going on for a while now, he said. If I ever catch the bastard, I'll beat hell out of him. He struck a match. The flame pulled toward the cigar as he puffed, and the tip glowed orange for a second. He shook out the match, and as smoke filled the room, my jaw clenched, and I knew me and Conley had both been played for fools. For the first time since sitting across from him, I looked my cousin dead in the eye. I'd thump him too. I decided to fold my losing hand, so I stood and reached for the doorknob. Conley said my name and I turned. He held a new cigar toward me. Keep your ears open. I strode to the lumberyard and switched on the saw. I set the end of the board next to the spinning blade and guided it. The saw made a high pitch as the teeth ripped into the lumber and tore through the top of the board. I watched the blur. When I pushed too hard, the saw's tone changed, and I smelled burnt wood. Sawdust sprayed. Later, when the whistle blowed, I kept working. Head down, fingers clear of the blade, catching up from yesterday and looking forward to Mama's visit. Then Abigail's next chapter begins with her in Coleman. You hardly spoke to Billy Sue. Jesse didn't look up. I craned my neck trying to catch his eye. Nadine had given him a plate of fried chicken and mashed potatoes, and he put the leftovers in the refrigerator. You should do things together. We done a lot when I first come to town. I bet she has a pretty friend you could meet. She's usually with her boyfriend. Boyfriend? She didn't mention him. Never does.
The novel by Mark L. Brooks that he describes as a redneck pulp fiction is titled Laying Autumn's Dust. This is Open Book. I'm Richard Winham. Thank you again for your attention and for your support. Good night.